We are going to wait for another minute just for some more people to join us. Thank you. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here today for our 11th Annual Women Faculty Leadership Institute. I'm Susanna Rose, and I'm the Vice Provost of the Office to Advance Women Equity and Diversity. It's my pleasure to welcome you. Normally, this would be an in-person event where we could actually do a lot of networking. So this is our second year of doing this in a Zoom environment. But we're happy so many of you are joining us, and some of you joined us for the coffee hour ahead of time. So we got to get connected a slight bit. So what we have from 11 to 12 today is our keynote speakers, who will be discussing how the devaluation of scholarly work can be a barrier to faculty diversity. Scholarly devaluation may act as a barrier to the number, retention, and advancement of underrepresented racial minority faculty in the academy, as well as to women's studies scholars, as it leads to their research, teaching, and scholarly identity being diminished, seen as illegitimate and lacking merit. Caroline Simpson and I happened to hear NiCole Buchanan and Isis Settles give this talk at an Inclusive Excellence workshop at University of California, Davis. And we were so impressed with the way they approached this topic, which has really been unrecognized as a form of systemic racism and sexism in the academy. So this webinar will explore how this scholarly devaluation operates formally and informally, and the consequences of such exclusion, and strategies to enhance diversity and inclusion on campus. So we're happy you're here today because this event has led to some important changes for women faculty at FIU. Some years ago, we did roundtables where everybody wrote down what they wanted to have happen at FIU to improve this situation for women faculty. And that was sent to the provost, and one of the requests was to have an office that would address these issues. And that led to the establishment of this Office to Advance Women Equity and Diversity. So there really is power in us joining together in common goals. So I want to thank you for your support all these years. Our office, AWED, as we refer to it, runs the National Science Foundation Institutional Transformation Grant. This award was given in 2016, $3.2 million to focus on inclusive excellence in the academy and to increase the number of women in the STEM fields. This event, which we call affectionately WFLI, is designed to promote leadership and strategic career planning. And we focus on skills training, networking, and identifying strategies to improve FIU's institutional climate. I know we're all extremely busy, so I'm glad you've dedicated the time to attending this webinar today. I know the experience will be beneficial, and I hope we all leave with a deeper understanding of the challenges posed by scholarly devaluation. During the webinar, you can submit questions, but the chat is disabled. So we'll have a Q&A, and then our speakers will also join the panel at 12 to 1 o'clock to answer further questions. Let me introduce the speakers now. NiCole Buchanan is professor of psychology at Michigan State University. She researches the interplay of race, gender, and victimization and how they impact the nature of harassment, its impact in organizational best practices. She also studies faculty of color and the ways in which their research is marginalized. She has been highlighted in hundreds of media outlets and on TEDx and NPR, and provides bias and diversity related training and consultation. So happy to have you here today. Isis Settles is professor of psychology and Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. She uses an interdisciplinary intersectional framework to focus on the experiences, perceptions, and consequences of unfair treatment directed at devalued social group members, and on protective factors and coping strategies used to counteract experiences of mistreatment. She's received national awards for her research and service and has been funded by the National Institute of Mental Health and the National Science Foundation. We're so glad to have these two illustrious speakers here today. So I'm going to turn it over to NiCole and Isis. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'll go ahead and start a screen share. One second. Are the slides visible and good?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay. So we'll go ahead and get started here today. I'm very happy to be here, and it's an honor to have been asked to share this research with you today. Before I start, I want to acknowledge that as part of our legacy at MSU, part of that is the fact that our institution occupies the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary lands of the Anishinaabe Three Fires Confederacy of the Ojibwe, Ottawa, and Potawatomi peoples. U of M, where Isis is, also occupies their lands and those of the Seneca, Delaware, Shawnee, and Wendat nations. We affirm Indigenous sovereignty. We stand in solidarity with Michigan's 12 federally recognized Indian nations, as well as those without federal recognition. We stand in solidarity with the historic Indigenous communities in Michigan, with Indigenous individuals and communities who live here now, and those who were forcibly removed from their homelands. In offering this land acknowledgement, we also commit to working to hold our institutions accountable to the needs of American Indian and Indigenous peoples. So once again, thank you for inviting us here today. As we strive for better academia, we have to also recognize that epistemic exclusion and other forms of research biases do stymie our efforts at full inclusion and the ability of our scholarship to reach its full potential in regard to innovation, impact, and relevance. And as I start this talk, I also want to thank and acknowledge that this work has been made possible as a result of funding from a variety of several programs, local and federal. And despite what I believe is the clear brilliance of this work, I do want to remind us that the opinions, suggestions, and recommendations that we are going to present today are those of our research team and do not necessarily reflect our funders. I also want to take a minute to introduce you to our amazing group of collaborators. As you can see, we are a distinctive interdisciplinary team representing diversity across race, gender, disciplines, perspectives, and our scholarly approaches. And in representing our team and showing you how diverse our backgrounds are is important because part of our argument today is that diversity leads to scholarly excellence and it leads to innovation, and our diversity directly contributes to our team's success. You may know of scholar Michelle Fine. She described academia as an increasingly gated community where exclusivity is the rule, noting that there is a creeping hegemony of publications, grants, that creates a very limited definition of what can be considered valid, rigorous research, methods, topics, and populations of study. So our scholarship has to begin to embrace the richness and the nuance that's involved in centering things like social justice, intersectionality, and diversity, and then creating space for these topics to exist within scholars, students, practice theory, and our research. As we are integrating our science with these tenets, it's going to also demand that we hone our skills and our tools so that we can make our vision of academia a reality. We're going to have to implement policies, practices, methodologies that actually promote social justice, and then invite in scholars that represent the world out there so that we can generate scholarship that is relevant to the outside world. But of course, this is not an easy task. So today we will discuss why academia has resisted these frameworks. We'll highlight the biases and blind spots that can hinder our ability to support and recognize more diverse research, as well as recognizing the scholars that are producing that scholarship. And we'll offer some strategies for increasing their integration into research and in academia more broadly. I believe a shift like this will increase diverse scholars over time in our various fields, transform the nature of the questions that we ask in our research, the manner in which we are conducting interventions, and the relevance of our scholarship for the populations we serve. I'm not going to go item by item for these next couple of slides, because what I really want to drive home is the most important point, that academic diversity is important for a variety of reasons. Specifically, diversity promotes scholarly innovation and discoveries that are more likely to have significant and even global impact, and then expands our fields of knowledge overall. Diversity also transforms the educational experiences of students. Students who are taught by diverse faculty demonstrate improved academic outcomes, things like better thinking, better problem-solving skills, and they become more effective leaders. And institutions with strong diversity and inclusion practices find that their employees and their students are more engaged and invested in the institution. They can attract better candidates, and then they can shape the field by actively modeling the types of behaviors that create environments where scholarship flourishes. But if we look at most campuses and we look at most faculty, people are already pretty successful in their scholarly endeavors with teams that are fairly homogeneous, which can make it difficult to get buy-in that this is an important thing to consider and that increasing diversity across our research teams and our scholarships is a worthy endeavor. So why should you care about diversity, inclusion, and research? Well, at the simplest level, better science, better scholarship is the result of diversity. And the absence of diversity is actually quite costly, and often costly in ways that we don't see, it's not obvious, but the added costs over time are sizable. For example, if we look at things like treatment studies, take heart attack symptoms, because women were never included in the initial studies, we have decades of heart research that did not address their symptoms appropriately and led to a very real cost in women's lives. Individuals, institutions, even entire research fields will find that their reputations are diminished when it becomes known that they don't welcome diversity and inclusion, which reduces trust, engagement, restricts the ability to attract diverse talent, leads to diverse talent turning towards mentors, institutions, and fields that do have positive reputations for diversity and inclusion, which of course then will perpetuate the restricted pipeline of diverse talent in our various fields. And while this may be an unusual place to speak, given that we're in an academic center, I believe we should care because it's just the right thing to do. Our scholarship, my belief is, our scholarship should be in service of and relevant to the populations that are funding our research via their hard-earned tax dollars. But given that we know all of this about diversity and its benefits, why is it so darn hard in academia? At the most basic level, both current and projected demographics show that academia is ill-equipped to meet the needs of our increasingly diverse population. If we go by 2017 numbers, despite only 60% of the US population identifying as non-Hispanic white, they were and continue to be overrepresented in academia, with over 75% of faculty identifying as white. Among faculty of color, Black, Latinx, and Native faculty are all significantly underrepresented, and only Asian faculty are overrepresented, being 6% of the population, but 10% of faculty. But I do want to emphasize that being technically overrepresented in academia does not necessarily protect in any way, shape, or form from the harmful negative experiences that people can have. And the lack of diversity has a number of negative consequences. For example, most scholars have had very little exposure to the kinds of high quality, relevant research related to diverse populations. And the lack of exposure to the topic means that they're often unprepared to discuss, let alone research, issues related to diversity and social justice. This increases resistance to the topics and a reluctance to engage those who discuss these kinds of issues. And the resistance to these topics creates a hostile environment for scholars of color. Some faculty of color report feeling a cultural disconnect or a divide between their racial ethnic culture and that of the university. And this can result in feelings of otherness and a lack of belonging. They also talk about experiences of things like tokenism, being the only member of their group in a different academic context, and as a result, being expected to represent their group. They experience hypervisibility. That this is also related to token status, but with this hypervisibility, they are subjected to heightened scrutiny and increased surveillance. So any possible mistake is blown up and identified and publicized. Faculty of color also describe experiences of social exclusion that prevent the workplace from becoming that welcoming space that we all deserve. And this excludes them also from important work-related information that can be transmitted during social functions. And these kind of challenges have long-lasting impact. For example, undergraduate and graduate students of color self-select out of the fields where they're not represented and move into those disciplines that have the faculty and the research that reflect them, their interests, and their goals. This brings us to epistemic exclusion. Our team proposes that epistemic exclusion is a form of scholarly devaluation that is associated with a variety of negative work and psychological outcomes for women and faculty of color. And let's talk a little bit about what we mean by research that's centered and research that's on the margins. So before we go deep into epistemic exclusion, there are certain types of scholarship where if we look broadly, we can look at a field and determine like what is considered within that disciplinary norm and what is considered on the margin. So often work that is in the center of a discipline will reflect only that discipline's norms, whereas work on the margins is more likely to be interdisciplinary, as an example. Work in the center of a discipline might focus on basic processes and be more theoretical, whereas work on the margins is often applied. Work in the center of a discipline might be quantitative rather than qualitative, or focus on biological factors rather than behavioral factors. And traditional work may prioritize generalizable results that cut across the average population versus results that are very specific to a marginalized population of interest. Centered research will often focus on dominant group members and things that dominant group members find important, whereas marginal research on the margins may be more likely to focus on marginalized group members and their concerns. Centered research will often purport to be untouched by values and bias, whereas research that is deeply political and personal is often marginalized. And most traditional research pretends that the researcher is a neutral conduit for post-positivist truth, that any potential bias is controlled by the research process itself, as opposed to a lot of research that may be on the margins that may actually be central to the life of the researcher. It is deeply personal and where their bias is acknowledged as part of the research process itself and could be actually embedded in factors. Their research may be embedded in factors that make it impossible to be neutral. And in some cases, neutrality could actually reflect pathology in the face of human suffering. I also want to address a question we often get is, how is epistemic exclusion different from just gatekeeping? And we propose that it is indeed different. Academic gatekeeping could be touched by bias, of course, but academic gatekeeping is also part of the responsible mechanisms that a field might use to ensure competence in the field. With epistemic exclusion, or I'll often say EE, those in power have often been successful by engaging in traditional and mainstream scholarship, which yields them epistemic power. Those with epistemic power establish and maintain disciplinary norms and define what kind of work is considered marginal and what work is considered innovative and within the norms of the field. EE functions to then reify these dominant or traditional academic endeavors by creating methods of scholarly assessment and recognition that will then privilege mainstream research and researchers. And because the existing system is one that made them successful and powerful, they have very little incentive to change it or challenge it. And this then disproportionately harms those whose research is constrained to the margins. As a consequence, we see it limits the proliferation of marginalized research and the dissemination of their findings. Epistemic exclusion is rooted in invisible biases about our disciplines and about different social groups and members of those groups. These invisible biases are then built into systems of evaluation where seemingly neutral performance standards actually will reflect these disciplinary biases about the characteristics of what makes good scholarship. And these characteristics then center mainstream research and mainstream researchers. And so we theorize that EE occurs as a result of these two related forms of bias. So prejudice towards faculty of color becomes rooted in negative, or is rooted in negative stereotypes about their intelligence and about their foreignness, but this is seen as unacceptable. So this kind of bias is not directly expressed. Instead, it becomes expressed through the devaluation of their non-traditional scholarship. The second form of bias reflects an assumption that any legitimate scholarship is already going to follow disciplinary norms, things like objectivity, researcher neutrality, and it's going to have a focus that is relevant to dominant group members and the concerns that dominant group members prioritize. And notably, for marginalized group members, their social position or their situatedness and their outsider within status increases the likelihood that they are going to have a different lived experience from dominant group members, which often then influences their scholarly interests and make it more likely that they will conduct research that's on the outside of the disciplinary norms. So being outside of disciplinary norms then means they're also more likely to be deemed as illegitimate scholars. I want to also point out another factor, and that is that the second form of bias can actually function as cover for the first. When someone has implicit biases, they can express their prejudice through the rejection of non-traditional scholarship that marginalized group members are more likely to engage in. And rather than saying, oh, these faculty are not competent, they can fall back on their perceived problems with the scholarship, which in academia is socially acceptable. This allows them to pretend that the fact that marginalized faculty happen to engage in that devalued scholarship is just coincidence. As such, the disciplinary biases about the boundaries of quality scholarship are coupled with identity-based biases regarding marginalized groups that then thwart their objective evaluation. And given that faculty merit is determined by these types of systems of evaluation, these forms of bias disproportionately impact the hiring, advancement, and promotion of women and of faculty of color, and then act as barriers to inclusion, to equity, and to the full scholarly development of our various fields. I'm going to turn it over to Isis.
So I'm going to take over and share with you some of our research on epistemic exclusion. So our most significant project was interviews that we conducted with 118 faculty of color. And we observed from the data that epistemic exclusion occurred through two processes. So first, epistemic exclusion operated through formal hierarchies, which are ways that the institution established a system of disciplinary norms, denoting what scholarship and types of academic engagement were valuable, important, or significant. Second, informal processes were not codified in university procedures and hierarchies, but nonetheless devalue their scholarship and cast them as illegitimate scholars. So I'm going to talk about each of these pathways in a little bit more detail. So again, epistemic exclusion was embedded in formal hierarchies of evaluation that the university used to make merit, promotion, and tenure decisions. The faculty in our study described that the standards around scholarship and performance requirements were often unclear or changeable. Further, the participants felt that higher standards were applied to them as compared to their white colleagues, such that once they achieved the stated standard, it would, shapeshift, so they were once again defined as missing the bar. There were particular challenges in how outside rubrics were used as validation of research quality, such as federally funded grant-based research being conferred higher value, and the size of one's grant then being used to scale the value of the research and the scholar conducting the scholarship. And this is despite recent evidence that research grants from people of color are less likely to be funded, and that this is due to their focus on marginalized populations. And there were several ways in which the publication outlets were subject to epistemic exclusion. For example, one way was that research quality was assessed was by the perceived quality of the publication outlet, the journal, or the press, as determined by criteria like impact factor, rejection rate, and perceived prestige. And of course, impact factors were never intended to serve as an assessment of the quality of an individual paper, because impact factors are heavily influenced by subscribership, which in turn is heavily influenced by the extent to which that content appeals to a wide mainstream audience. And journals with the highest impact factors tend not to focus on social justice, marginalized populations, and related issues, and as a result, don't accept many papers each year with these foci. So as a result, research with a smaller body of scholars is more likely to be published in journals focused on those topics rather than in more generalist journals. So together, federal grants and publication outlets were used to define what research is of quality and what should be cast to the margins without acknowledgement that each of these criteria actually favored disciplinary scholarship. And as a result, research on disciplinary margins is disadvantaged in these evaluation processes. And then we found that epistemic exclusion occurred because some types of scholarship were evaluated as lower in quality based on a number of factors. And so these factors are shown here. When the topic or population of interest for their work were perceived as being situated on the disciplinary margins, participants perceived that their work was valued as being lesser quality than mainstream traditional research of their colleagues. And we found that this was most common among scholars who studied race, gender, or other marginalized groups, but also occurred in fields that are thought of as identity neutral or more basic sciences. So for example, studying lipids as opposed to studying proteins' impact on inflammation, or studying RNA rather than DNA, was also identified as valued, as devalued as outside of the field's valued canon. We also found that it was felt by faculty who were teaching about marginalized groups. Faculty doing international research or community engaged scholarship reported that their research was not seen as worthwhile, and the time and resource intensive nature of the work was not recognized or accounted for in the assessment of their work and productivity. Similarly, faculty teaching about social justice topics or doing applied research that sought to solve social problems perceived that their work was also devalued as being subjective and politically motivated rather than objective and scientifically planned. And then finally, faculty teaching about or using methods less common in their disciplines also felt their scholarship was devalued. And in our study, this was most commonly noted by those who centered qualitative research as opposed to quantitative methods, given that qualitative research is devalued in a number of fields. So these factors related to the teaching or research topic being connected to the individual salient identities, being community engaged or social justice focused, or related to less common methods, are often criticized as biased and subjective and denounced as self-indulgent research that lacks generalizability. And as a result, these types of scholarship and teaching fail the gold standards used to determine the legitimacy of academic endeavors, such as objectivity, detachment, generalizability, and these factors are used to justify relegating the work or the teaching to the margins. Epistemic exclusion also occurred informally. So informal processes included experiences in which faculty were made to feel invisible because their accomplishments were overlooked, even when those accomplishments reflected the formal metrics set out by their departments. Recognition could take a number of different forms, including written or online mentions, verbal praise, promotion or tenure, or merit raises. And participants talked about how they had not been recognized in these different ways for their research, teaching, or service. Epistemic exclusion was also informally communicated through messages that conveyed to the faculty of color that they're not perceived as legitimate or as having real scholarly abilities. This was also seen in the teaching context, where students challenged their legitimacy and colleagues did not see the value of the courses they taught. So as a result, participants felt they had to continually and repeatedly prove their worth. And then a third way that epistemic exclusion was communicated was through a lack of comprehension. So faculty talked about how others expressed not understanding their scholarship, and as a result, not seeing why it was important. And because their work was not important, colleagues were disinterested in gaining knowledge about it. Our research shows that the consequences of epistemic exclusion are substantial for the individuals experiencing it, as well as for the institution as a whole. At the individual level, participants described consequences for their research, work, and career progression. And to avoid epistemic exclusion, they sometimes limited or even changed the scope of their scholarship to try to fit disciplinary norms. And this, of course, resulted in them being less productive and less engaged in their research. It had consequences for promotion and tenure decisions when the work of faculty of color was perceived as not good enough, or if the research was discussed in biased ways because it was on the margin. Participants directly tied the value of their work to pay, noting that when one isn't valued as a scholar, one doesn't receive merit pay raises. And individuals also suffered psychologically from epistemic exclusion. It made them feel unhappy and dissatisfied with their jobs. They felt a lack of belonging and isolation, uncertainty, and a lack of control. They also described feeling crazy because the messages they were receiving from others differed from their self-perceptions. And then finally, participants talked about some institutional consequences of epistemic exclusion. And most significant was the loss of talent through high faculty turnover. Additionally, some noted the reputational harm to the institution as a place not supportive of faculty of color. And because we were interested in these workplace outcomes, we used survey data from over 1,100 faculty at a different institution. And we found that those faculty experiencing more epistemic exclusion were also more likely to report turnover intentions, which means they were more likely to think about leaving the institution. We found that this relationship was partially explained by the fact that epistemic exclusion was related to faculty feeling less satisfied with their jobs and perceiving the climate in their department more negatively. Further, we found that women reported more epistemic exclusion than men. We also found that underrepresented minority faculty reported more epistemic exclusion than white faculty, with Asian participants falling in between. And interestingly, even though women and underrepresented minority faculty were more likely to experience epistemic exclusion, for all faculty, epistemic exclusion was related to those negative outcomes I showed on the last slide: lower job satisfaction, more negative climate perceptions, and greater turnover intentions. So we suggest that epistemic exclusion has consequences for scholarship and knowledge production generally. This type of gatekeeping produces disciplinary inertia, such that things continue to be done in the same ways and innovation occurs more slowly. It limits the scope of the questions being asked and the dissemination and adaptation of findings to the public and to other scholars. Epistemic exclusion limits the breadth and inclusion of academia. We suggest that it offers a novel reason why faculty who are hired may not be retained or promoted. It can account for the limited success in creating a more diverse faculty by highlighting this type of evaluation bias as contributing to a revolving door of marginalized faculty. Epistemic exclusion can also affect early career faculty who are not hired because their scholarship is viewed as lower quality or outside of disciplinary boundaries. And further, epistemic exclusion continues or contributes to the disconnect between the ivory tower, the populations we serve, and the public that funds our work. So we believe that epistemic exclusion can take place across the academic career. If we think about education, we teach graduate students about these disciplinary norms. This then influences what knowledge students are exposed to and can influence whether students are encouraged or discouraged to pursue particular areas. Students interested in doing work on disciplinary margins may not apply for graduate school, thinking about academia as a place where they would be unwelcome, or they may not be accepted into graduate schools if they do apply. In hiring, job ads can be written in ways that exclude people who work on the margins. It can also impact which applications are even considered by determining whether reviewers consider an applicant's scholarly area as being within the scope of what a unit is looking for or outside of that area. And epistemic exclusion is particularly impactful for promotion. Our data suggests that it is a barrier to the promotion of women and faculty of color, which can lead to turnover, but is also seen in the problem of women and faculty of color disproportionately being stuck at associate rank. And although our studies focus primarily on scholarship, we believe that epistemic exclusion affects other areas of the academic life, other academic content. So in teaching, epistemic exclusion affects what content is covered within classes, as well as the very classes offered themselves. So our classes on marginalized populations or non-traditional methods deemed as important parts of the curriculum. Similarly, epistemic exclusion affects what types of service are valued. We know that DEI-related service or mentoring students is less valued than other more visible forms of service. These forms are often not even considered during evaluation processes. Service to the community is often devalued, even if it ties to one's scholarship, and particularly if that community is marginalized. The value of public engagement depends on the intended audience and the outlets of the work. So for example, engagement through mainstream media is more valued than media directed at a minority audience. So you could imagine, for example, the difference of the prestige or the impact of public engagement through the New York Times or the Chronicle of Higher Education, rather than through a publication targeting women or racially marginalized groups. And the same epistemic exclusion processes that occur in faculty departmental reviews also occur in journal and grant reviews, in which scholars and scholarship are held to higher standards and undergo greater scrutiny. And then finally, epistemic exclusion affects prominence. You could be very well known in your professional area, but if that area is not the mainstream, that prominent status can be devalued or not recognized by colleagues. So we want to end by offering some recommendations for countering epistemic exclusion. First, to reduce epistemic exclusion, it's important to raise awareness of this form of bias. So institutions and departments need to have explicit conversations regarding disciplinary biases about the characteristics of good scholarship. Do they center mainstream research and researchers? Are there places where bias is introduced in the process? Disciplinary bias trainings could help to raise awareness. And in fact, at University of Michigan, our advanced programs faculty recruitment workshops have started including subfield bias as part of our training workshops for search committee members. Similarly, implicit bias training could work to address the prejudice towards marginalized groups that we believe undergirds epistemic exclusion. A major step would be shifting our values and norms to reconceptualize work on the margins. So this might involve thinking about work at the disciplinary margins as cutting edge rather than marginal. It might also involve seeing work on marginalized communities, novel methods, and work addressing social problems as a strength and core to the mission of higher education. Next, we would require a shift in policies and practices to reflect those changing values. So this could take the form of rethinking appropriate metrics, such as valuing more niche or topical journals as much as journals in the mainstream, or reducing our reliance on external metrics like grants or impact factors to tell us what scholarship is important and makes a contribution. Departments could formalize processes for utilizing outside faculty members on evaluation committees when the departments lack the expertise needed to properly evaluate scholarship. And it's critical to change reward structures because doing so provides the necessary weight to value statements and can lead to real change in faculty career outcomes. And finally, accountability is critical. So this could involve continued monitoring of faculty hiring, advancement, and retention, or longitudinal climate surveys that track perceptions of marginalized faculty to see if the policy changes result in more welcoming and supportive environments. And I want to note that in addressing epistemic exclusion, we have no desire to exclude scholars working in the center. It's not a zero-sum game. We feel that novel approaches do not detract from the contribution of such work, and that there's really enough room for everybody to sit at the table and to shape the field. And more broadly, there are some things that we can do to change how science thinks about research and inclusion. Transforming the culture of science requires a change in who is in the field. So we have to increase the diversity of the pipeline of undergraduate and graduate student trainees if we really hope to impact the field and the faculty workforce in any significant way. This requires that we increase faculty diversity at all levels and really work to retain them. We have had a leaky pipeline with challenges at entry for people of color and women, especially those representing intersecting marginalized identities, such as first generation, low income, or queer women of color. Being underrepresented in the field, having your research focus marginalized and devalued, and learning about negative experiences of marginalized faculty, scholars, can lead doctoral candidates to pursue careers outside of academia. And it leads to difficulties retaining them, even if they embark on an academic career. So diversifying science will require an understanding of the unique stressors that marginalized students and faculty face, particularly barriers to having their research embraced and recognized. To create change, we also have to transform our standards for research, publications, and grants in science. And in many fields, we have to make the study of variables like gender, social class, race, ethnicity, and their intersections the gold standard of good science. We can make sure to cite scholars from include marginalized voices, and where relevant, to make sure authors report relevant demographic features of their samples and define the extent to which their findings are generalizable across groups. Journals and funding agencies need to be open to methods, approaches, and ways of knowing that differ from the mainstream. And this, of course, may require broadening their reviewer pool to those with expertise that they currently lack. It also means shifting who has power, for example, increasing representation of marginalized scholars on editorial boards or grant review panels. Journals and grants can evaluate their processes for unintended bias, but also look for disparate impact. So if they see that women are less likely to be published than men, then they have an obligation to figure out how to address that discrepancy structurally, and not by attributing such differences in outcomes to gender differences in ability. And at the same time, organizations have to be cognizant that their attempts to diversify review boards or editorial positions creates increased service demands on scholars from marginalized groups. So in conclusion, the change that we're proposing here will be a radical departure from our norms in academia, but we feel it's desperately needed for science to remain relevant in the United States of today and tomorrow, and for our increasingly diverse global society. This alternate path embraces the richness and nuance involved in centering social justice, intersectionality, diversity, and creating spaces for these topics to exist within scholars, theory, and research. This path will increase access for scholars from marginalized groups, which can really transform the nature and questions asked in research, teaching, and service, and the relevance of our work to the populations we serve. We'll just end by saying, if you take a picture of this QR code, it will take you to a Google Doc that provides some additional resources as well as ways to contact us. So we thank you for being here and for inviting us, and look forward to answering some questions.
Okay, hi everyone. I'm Kirsten Wood. I'm an associate professor in the history department in the Green School and also one of the associate directors in the Office to Advance Women, Equity, and Diversity. And I am going to be moderating a short Q&A session now, and then we'll take a bit of a break, and then we'll come back for a panel and some additional chance for Q&A. So we get 2 bites at the Q&A apple this morning. So I have some questions prepared myself, but I'm also going to be looking in the Q&A for questions. And let's see, Susanna Rose has a question. She wanted to ask how your work has been received, your own work in this area of epistemic exclusion has been received in your respective institutions.
Well, I'll say that at the University of Michigan, I think it's been received very well. And one of my other hats is that I'm the associate director of our advanced program, and I sit on the committee that develops the faculty recruitment workshops. And so I was really gratified that as the committee that does the development of the workshops was introduced to this work, they could really see it across a number of different disciplines. So, you know, as we say in the talk, it's not just experienced by scholars who do work on marginalized populations, that it is across fields, even in natural sciences and places you wouldn't expect to see it. And so I think there's been really good reception and again, a desire to incorporate it and to address it within the institution.
And I would say my institution, it's been a little bit more mixed. The College of Arts and Letters, which is not the college I am in, has actually, they were one of the first to embrace the work and actually put together some initiatives to begin to counter it in their hiring and their review process. So that was really exciting to see. And now our College of Social Science is entertaining some of the discussion anew this year.
Thank you. That's encouraging to hear. We have a question from Suzanne Copter. She says, she writes, it seems that in the olden days, the professor's value was judged by publications. Now it's all about the money. I think she means the research money. Can you comment on this with regard to underrepresented faculty in terms of the ways that the publication, the publication count may have been a problem in one way, and maybe the research dollars could be a problem in a new way that we need to think about perhaps differently?
This is a huge issue, and it hasn't replaced publications. It's now added another set of requirements and hurdles for people. And the data is really clear. NSF released after 10 years of significant efforts to make changes, the numbers of PIs of color have stayed absolutely the same. It hasn't changed anything. And part of that is because of the fact that the people doing the reviews, like those processes are still embedded in a series of biases that aren't being discussed overtly, and nothing's being done to actively counter them. So they're going to need to create some significant changes in the program announcements, how they're doing reviews, who's on these review panels, and really looking at where are the biases showing up. For example, we know that some of the problems with NIH and NSF funding for faculty of color is often because the topics and the way they are looking at, say, health disparities is different, has a different lens, sometimes has different methods, and that those things then are denigrated in the review process and they don't get funded. One, we need the institutions to understand that that is what's at the bottom of the process. Instead of using these external sources as a way of saying whether or not the work is good, being able to acknowledge the fact that these external sources are also embedded in the same types of biases. And institutions have been reticent to do that. There also needs to be some questions about why are we getting the funding? Do we need this funding to do all of the projects that we want to do? And people who don't need that level of funding, there should be a mechanism for them to just do good work without being penalized because their work is easily done without huge grants. Right now, a lot of institutions are really funding their inner workings by forcing faculty to write grants in an increasingly competitive environment for getting the grants. And so there's something about the entire process that needs to be revisited. Isis, did you have anything you want to add?
The only thing I'll add is that, all of these counting publications, looking at impact factors, looking at age index, looking at grant dollars, right? These are all just shortcuts that we're using to try to make assessments of quality of work. And so part of what we're arguing is that we can't just rely on the external metrics because the bias is built into their processes as well. We need to figure out alternative ways to use our expertise to be able to evaluate scholarship. And if departments don't have that expertise, then they need to go out and find the experts in the area to give them their judgment. I mean, that's what we do in external review processes for promotion and tenure, right? You're asking outside experts to judge the work. So I think we just need to spend more time in making these assessments and not use these shortcuts that are numeric and very easily quantified.
Thank you for those answers. Let's see. There's a question here, which is about, so this is from Daryl Dickerson, about what are some ways that organizations can manage the increase in service that women and faculty of color may be asked to do, not necessarily internally, but because of efforts to diversify editorial boards and review panels. So this is obviously really important work to counter the epistemic exclusion you're talking about. But what are some practical ways that that institutions, higher ed institutions, might help with this rather than making that become another millstone around the necks of faculty of color?
Isis, did you have a?
So Carrie Ann O'Mara and her group have a beautiful equity-minded service workbook and report. And there's like a set of handouts where you can think about service work in different ways in departments. And so that doesn't exactly address the outside demands on service, but I think it's really brilliant because it's increasing the transparency in the in equity in how service is determined, and it can give weight to more or less weight to different kinds of service. So I can share that at some point when I can dig it out, but it's really great. I think it's a really big problem that universities expect internal service, but then you also need to do this external service because that's how you show that you have professional standing. But also it's often because you want to give to the profession that you care about, and you want to be able to make positive change in the profession. And so, the challenge is who should be providing the relief from service, right? Because I think the problem is really that universities expect you to just add things on top of each other, and time is finite. And so there's only so much you can add before it has really negative consequences. So things have to come off. So institutions could try to recognize that burden if they also value that their faculty are trying to improve the profession. So they could be removing some other internal service obligations or counting it towards teaching. The other thing is that external organizations could compensate people for their work. So we have this idea that if you pay people, that then they're no longer going to be objective in their reviews. They're going to do it just for the money. But I think really recognizing that people's time is valuable is really critical to changing our way of viewing the importance of this work.
Thank you for that. The idea that we can't keep adding to the pile. Oh, sorry, go ahead, please.
I wanted to add one other piece of that because I want to also contextualize this conversation within this larger global pandemic and the proliferation of images of brutality against Black and Brown people, because part of what's also happening is there's an increased urgency for representation, and the requests are going to the same people that are subject to the most harm from COVID and to police brutality and all of this multitude of other stressors. And so we need to also be thoughtful of, as we're making these requests, people are already in a position at this point in time where they kind of psychologically, physically, emotionally are tapped out. And so not kind of just going on what is happening today, but being mindful of how these requests are more likely to be turned down, perhaps. That does not mean those individuals are disinterested, and it doesn't mean you shouldn't come back to them, but recognizing that we're simultaneously asking more of the people that are at the brunt of several of the global problems right now.
Thank you for that additional comment. I'm looking at the clock and we're running a little bit behind the schedule we had in mind, but we do want to make sure that everyone gets a chance for a break. So I want to say first that the questions that we haven't gotten to yet in the Q&A, we can return back to after we have our panel discussion, but we're going to take a break now. And I think I'm going to use my authority as the person who's speaking in this moment to say that we'll come back at 11:05 to resume with the panel discussion. So we will see you all shortly. Thank you for that really wonderful talk, and I look forward to having more conversation about it after our panel. So now we're officially on break. So it is now 12:05. I think that people should be coming back from break. I see people's cameras popping on, which is always an encouraging sign that there's life behind the screens. I was just typing up a question for the later Q&A. So I'll stop doing that and start welcoming everybody back. Let me make sure I'm looking at the right thing. So again, for those who don't know me or who are just joining us, I'm Kirsten Wood. I'm an associate professor in the Green School's History Department, and I'm also one of the associate directors in the Office to Advance Women, Equity, and Diversity. And it's my pleasure to be moderating the second half of our session today. In case anyone is joining us having missed part of the morning, let me briefly reintroduce our keynote speakers, Dr. NiCole Buchanan, Professor of Psychology at Michigan State University, and Dr. Isis Settles, Professor of Psychology and Afro-American and African Studies at the University of Michigan. I see a question in the chat if we can stop screen share. I don't know how to do that, so I hope someone will do that now. There we go. Now we're back in speaker view. Perfect. Thank you. Joining us to respond to Dr. Buchanan and Dr. Settles' really fascinating talk are two distinguished FIU faculty, Dr. Azawir Soli and Dr. Zahra Zahari. Dr. Wirsoli is Associate Professor of English here at FIU, and she's also an affiliate faculty in African and African Diaspora Studies, Women and Gender Studies, and the Latin American and Caribbean Center. The recipient of multiple Mellon Fellowships, Dr. Wirsoli received her PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. To support her research, she also received a Woodrow Wilson Career Enhancement Fellowship, which resulted in her 2009 scholarly book, Eroticism, Spirituality, and Resistance in Black Women's Writings. Dr. Wirsoli's scholarly works also include the co-edited anthology Caribbean Erotic, while her creative productions include two works of poetry, First Rain and The Woman Who Knew. Dr. Wirsoli is a frequent invited speaker and mentor at the annual Woodrow Wilson Foundation Career Enhancement Fellowship Conference. Dr. Zahra Hazari, is a professor in FIU's Department of Teaching and Learning and the STEM Transformation Institute. She also is an affiliated faculty member in the physics department. She received her PhD in physics education from the University of Toronto and then held a postdoctoral fellowship at the Harvard-Smithsonian Center for Astrophysics. For her research, Dr. Hazari earned a National Science Foundation Career Award. At last count, she has more than 80 publications to her name, and her work has been featured in prestigious venues such as Science Magazine, Scientific American, US News and World Report, and APS News. Dr. Hazari has served on the editorial board for the Journal of Research and Science Technology and on multiple professional committees on women in physics. Each of our respondents will be speaking for approximately 8 minutes, followed by a discussion among the panelists, and then with the audience as a whole as we return to the Q&A from the first half and then address additional questions as they arise. So please, we're looking forward to hearing from you. Thank you for being here.
Hello, good afternoon, everyone. I want to thank the organizers of this event. I also want to thank Dr. Settles and Dr. Buchanan and commend them for an amazing presentation. I think this is the kind of scholarship that we have been waiting for, the kind of work that we have been looking forward to. Because often when we bring up these kinds of concerns, we're kind of gaslighted, really, and told that somehow it's a personal thing. This is, maybe you're not liked enough. Maybe your scholarship is not good enough. So all of the things that you have outlined here are things that faculty of color have to deal with on a very regular basis in these institutions. And without the kind of scholarship that sheds light on these issues and kind of address some of the nuances, you know, that we're dealing with, it's really hard sometimes to make a case for yourself without it appearing as if somehow you're bitter or you're hating or you're just not a team player, or maybe you're just not the right type of person because others are thriving. So what is your problem? right? So I think it's really important to document these issues and to have scholarly gravitas behind them, which is what I think Dr. Settles and Dr. Buchanan has offered us today. So I really want to commend you for your scholarship, because this is much needed, and I think will make, I'm glad to hear that your institutions are standing behind you and that you're getting the kind of visibility that you really deserve, that the work that you're doing deserves, because I think that this can move us forward in a very positive direction, and it's so necessary right now. Has been necessary for, I don't know, ever from the beginning of academia, has been necessary to highlight some of these biases and prejudices that we really cannot see if somehow they are not framed in a particular way. And so it is your framing of them as well that I also want to commend, because how you frame things often helps people to see them more clearly. And so the framing here, I think, is as articulate as it could possibly be, and only those who have no ears will refuse to hear, and those who have no eyes will refuse to see. So thank you so much for this work. I personally do appreciate it. As someone who is a hybrid scholar myself, who considers myself to come from a tradition, a literary tradition of hybridity, interdisciplinarity, genre crossing, writing in poetry, writing theory, writing literary criticism, writing fiction. My first short story was published when I was in my early 20s. In 1989, you know, my first short story was published because I was an intern at the Feminist Press, and I met Paula Martina, who's the editor of that of the collection. This one called "I Am Your Sister." She ended up publishing my first short story in that collection. But I was writing poetry and performing poetry with Pamela Sneed and Cheryl Boyce Taylor and Asha Bandeli and other people. A lot of you probably do know, in New York City at the time when this was published. So I was a poet in the community in New York before I went to graduate school and got the PhD. So I always considered myself a poet first. So the idea of having to choose, doesn't feel like an option to me. It has never felt like a choice. I consider myself a poet first, but the idea of having to choose one field has never felt like a real choice. I don't feel like I'm limited to writing poetry, but at the same time, I come from this literary tradition that Audre Lorde comes from. She writes poetry, she writes theory, she writes biomythography. I come from the same tradition Toni Morrison comes from. She writes novels, amazing novels, but she also writes criticism, literary criticism. Derek Walcott does the same thing. Kamal Brathwaite does the same thing. Sylvia Winters is recognized as one of our major literary critics, and she wrote the fabulous book, The Hills of Hebron, which is still one of my favorite Caribbean texts. And a lot of people don't know her as a fiction writer, but she also writes fiction. And so, you know, this is a tradition that we come out of. And I'm speaking of the African diaspora here, not just of the Caribbean, where I'm from, but the entire diaspora, that is how we write. That is a part of our literary tradition, is to cross genres and jump through whatever those disciplines are, to do the interdisciplinary work, without which some of what we need to put forward into the world won't come forward, because you're kind of narrow, you're kind of relegated to a very narrow field of inquiry. If you're, you know, at least that's how some of us feel, who allow ourselves to kind of jump across the different disciplines and the different genres. We feel limited when we're not allowed to do so. So for those reasons, I really appreciate this moment. Appreciate the scholarship here. My own work, I think, as I said, I do poetry, I do criticism, I do fiction. I don't feel as if somehow that is recognized by my institution in the way that I think it ought to be. I've always felt like, you know, well, maybe you're not enough of a poet. Maybe you're not enough of a literary critic, not recognizing that in the aggregate, I am all of those things. And that is what should be rewarded, that the culmination, you know, of all of what I do, rather than looking at me through a particular prism, a particular lens that would in fact devalue the work that I do, which I think has been done. I think my work has been devalued. So I'm not going to be shy about stating that, because that is something that I feel, and it is crazy making, because you're recognized in the Caribbean. I'm recognized in England because my press is in England. So I'm recognized there, I'm recognized in the Caribbean, but in Miami, I feel marginalized. I'm like, how is that? You know, how am I marginalized in writing circles in Miami, but not internationally? How does that work out? How do we square that? But that's a reality. That's a reality. And I think that this is a kind of scholarship that lends credibility to these conversations that I would then bring up, because we have to be very careful about the myth of mediocrity, of meritocracy, how it seduces us into selling each other out for pennies. I understand that asking someone who is hungry to stand in his, her, their integrity is cruel, but hunger is relative, and so is freedom and everything else worth fighting for. We're now relearning what the ancients knew long ago, that fasting is good for the entire system, physically, mentally, and spiritually. There are some higher principles worth taking a stand on, right? And that does not mean that you have to give up the fight for the material reality, without which you may not be able to stand to fight at all. We can walk and chew gum, yeah? We can't allow ourselves to be weaponized against each other. We can't allow the powerful to use our weaknesses, our hungers, our words, and our hard-won lessons against us as a collective of marginalized voices and subjectivities. There's a hurricane brewing even now in the state of Florida, and those who value freedom and human dignity will be bowled over and washed out to sea unless we stand together as a collective. But how can we stand together when every time some of us who feel marginalized dare to speak up, we're gaslighted and dismissed as heretics, or worse, bitter haters? Even hate has been misnamed now and can now be weaponized to silence dissent. Be careful what definitions we swallow and regurgitate as we gaslight or seduce each other into further and more deadly silences that ultimately clear the way for the oppressors, who continuously and ubiquitously, it would appear, win. I'm going to end with two quotes by Lord. If I didn't define myself for myself, I would be crunched into other people's fantasies of me and eaten alive. It is not our differences that divide us. It is our inability to recognize, accept, and celebrate those differences. So thank you, Dr. Settles. Thank you, Dr. Buchanan. Thank you, Susanna Rose, Kirsten Wood, and everybody else who put this event together. I think it's an amazing event, and I look forward to the transformations that will happen as a result of this work.
Thank you for those powerful remarks. Dr. Hazari?
So thank you again, Dr. Settles and Buchanan. I'm sure, deeply inspired by your work. The issue of epistemic exclusion is part of a larger issue of epistemic injustice, where how knowledge is constructed the way we've constructed knowledge is very narrow and has been defined by very narrow groups in every field. And we can see this across every field. And I appreciate that our attendees are very diverse, coming from many different fields. And so I think they can probably all resonate with the fact that what counts in their field is defined by a narrow set of people. What is valued in their field is defined by a narrow set of people, and that set of people doesn't typically include diverse voices. And so I deeply appreciate your operationalizing the theoretical understanding of epistemic exclusion and how it plays out in the context of universities and institutions, and maybe some possibilities of what we can pragmatically do about it. So I deeply appreciate that. And in discussing or sort of introducing this idea, I think it resonates with me that we need to celebrate the work and the scholarship of those individuals whose voices have been excluded. So I'd like to draw on the work of Gloria Anzaldua's, and specifically her work on borderlands and the idea of Nepantla. I think it fits very well here, where the idea of Nepantla is that there are those who are in the middle, who are always in the middle. And just to reflect one small experience, in the course of my work, I have been told that what I do is not STEM, what I do is not physics, what I do is not science education by colleagues in science education. What I do is not gender work by colleagues who do gender work. What I do is not identity work from colleagues who do identity work. And so often when you're working at the boundaries, when you're working in the middle of many different disciplines and trying to negotiate those boundaries, you become defined by what you're not. And that definition is usually posed to you by other people and put in front of you by other people by explicit discourse that's telling you, well, you're not DBER. You know, a colleague at FIU told me I'm not DBER. I don't do discipline-based education research. A colleague has told me I'm not science education, who was a newly hired young faculty member who I was part of hiring, and even asked me, why are you in education? Why are you in teaching and learning? So we get, and even like the recognition we get starts to be meaningless. And I'll give one small example. I was elected an APS fellow this year. The APS is the American Physical Society. And yeah, thank you for the claps, Dr. Settles and Dr. Buchanan. And although it's a great honor, the only congratulatory emails I got were from a few of my colleagues in physics, because they know the gravitas of that. In my department, it has no value at all whatsoever, right? It's completely meaningless. So in the sphere that I work in teaching and learning, and my direct colleagues that I interact with day to day, it holds no value. And so this is how we often get caught in the middle, where even recognitions become meaningless in many ways. And people are hostile sometimes. So the response is that you've taken that recognition away from somebody who it could have been meaningful for, who was in a physics department, right? Being nominated or being elected to that. So it's very difficult work working at the boundaries. And for those of us who work at the boundaries, I think we've all experienced this. I have had the very great privilege of being successful in much of my work. Unlike many of my colleagues and scholars of color in my field, whose voices I've been working to lift, but that doesn't also success doesn't translate to sense of belonging. So you can be successful in a field and still not belong anywhere. And I think that's why the ideas of Gloria Anzaldúa, who was a Chicana feminist, post-colonial theorist, resonate so strongly with me, because you'll never prove yourself. You're always in the middle, and you'll always live in the middle. And I know that sounds very bleak, but I think you grow resistant to it. And especially if you recognize it. If you recognize it, you grow more resistant to it. And then you find other people in the middle to lock arms with. And those are often my women of color colleagues who I lock arms with in many of these issues.
Thank you for those comments, Dr. Hazari. Would anyone on the panel like to respond to each other at this point before I open it to the floor for questions?
I'll jump in. Thank you so much for sharing your words, Drs. Hazari and Wirsoli. I really appreciated hearing them. And it's just so striking how well your words resonate with the words from our qualitative interviews. So I don't know if it helps to know that it's a common phenomenon or not. And I wanted, Dr. Wirsoli, what your comments about poetry and criticism and the kind of genre crossing nature of your work resonated also with a finding that we see in our data, which is that humanities faculty report more epistemic exclusion than STEM faculty. Mm-hmm. And we're not sure about why, but our theory is right. There's so many different ways in which humanities scholarship, the forms that it takes, right? In science, it's like publications or books, right? the humanities. It can be poetry, it can be dance, right? It's art. And so I think that makes it easier because it feels subjective, right? For people to introduce the bias and the evaluation of it. So I really just wanted to highlight that that the humanities really kind of feel the brunt of this. And then Dr. Hazari, yeah, just wonderful words across both of them. But one of the things that you said about success doesn't guarantee kind of being valued also resonated, and the ways in which people become resistant or resilient. One of the things that we find with our faculty of color is that they talk about something we call strategic invisibility, which is the idea that they just kind of, they're focused on their work, but they distance themselves from colleagues because they don't want to deal with the kinds of kind of cruel words that you recounted and all that rejection, right? So they try to become invisible to their colleagues to avoid those negative interactions, but really just focus on their work and be successful in that domain. So I just wanted to make those connections and say thank you.
And I'll take a second to resonate. I was struck. One, both of you put what you said together in such beautiful ways. The poetry and the art of what you said just really resonated with me. I wrote some of the quotes because it was so beautiful, but, and it's heartbreaking, of course. It hurts to hear how the stories, they might have a tweak here that's different, a tweak here that's different, but it's the same story over and over and over again. And really, this is what those behind the scenes, those that are running, they have to understand and hear these stories. They have to decide that there's going to be something different that happens, and that we are going, these stories have meaning, they are valuable, and we are actively doing harm to the progress of our respective fields when we continue to allow individuals to have such a strong sense of being othered, of being devalued, of not getting the recognition they deserve, not getting the compensations they deserve, if they're not being recognized, that these have significant impacts. And I'm so sorry to hear how pervasive it is, and that it's for both of you, it's been a common theme throughout your entire career. And I would say, Isis and I, it's a lot of the stories that we hear have been also things that resonate with our own personal experience in the academy. And there really needs to be something actively addressing, and hopefully this work will contribute to that begins to decide to enforce change.
Yes, thank you. Thank you both so much for your responses. I want to make a correction in something I said. I said that I felt like I wasn't recognized in Miami, but let me clarify something, that I am recognized by the poetry community of color in Miami. It is by the larger dominant poetry community, which is quite powerful in Miami, writing community, which is quite powerful in Miami, that I feel that I have not been recognized by. And that includes many of my peers at FIU. I know I have one peer, Julie Wade, I have to give her props for, recognizing me and including me when she has that event with the Palm Beach Poetry Festival. But beyond that, it's as if I am not called upon outside of FIU, I am not called upon, with the exception of AADS, which I have to give them props. So also the African and African Diaspora Studies program, which has gone out of their way to make me feel valued, I think, ever since I've been here. But fascinatingly, it's been that program or my own attempts at visibility for myself, rather than the institution pulling me in, inviting me. This is an event that I've been invited to, and I'm like, yeah, this is great. This is what should be happening. And I've had a lot of these kinds of panel events since the pandemic, but prior to that, no. It's real. So the pandemic has changed some things, has shifted some things in a positive direction as well, in the sense that I guess you can get more visibility on Zoom, right? In some instances, but I'm not sure what to attribute that to, that I understand fully what to attribute all of that to, except to say that it does add to the service work that we're asked to do, that also keeps us away from the kinds of scholarly commitments that we want to do, that we already have books that I'm working on, that I should be working on today, but I'm really happy to contribute. You have to pick and choose what kind of events you will say yes to, and this is definitely one I wanted to say yes to. I also want to commend Susanna Rose while I'm here for actually encouraging me to spread my wings when I came saying, I don't feel like I'm being recognized. I don't feel like I'm being validated at FIU. And her saying to me, why don't you go out there, find something to do that will make you more visible in the larger community and see what impact that will have. That's what sent me to the Association of Caribbean Women Writers and Scholars. And I became and had me applying for a position on their membership board and became a VP since 2018. And now will be stepping into the presidential role in that organization in August of 2021. Now, that is something that I felt like I needed to do it. I'm glad that I did it, but I also wonder, why was it necessary for that to happen? Why couldn't I have been recognized at FIU and then been recognized outside because I'm already recognized? You know what I mean? Why did I have to go the other route? Because other people don't have to do that, right? And so that's part of what we're dealing with here. And I think it's really important. I'm glad that my colleague, Zahara, was transparent about the struggles that she's having in her department, because when one of us is transparent, it allows the others to be transparent as well. I think it's really important to recognize the value of transparency and also to say that we need to be cognizant of the ways in which people can be penalized for being transparent as well. Doesn't mean we're going to stop being transparent, but we also need to be very cognizant. That's what I meant about hunger. And what things are worth standing on, what moral grounds are worth standing on, despite what you may think the consequences could possibly be. Let's not assume that there are always no consequences, because the opposite of that is true, that often there are consequences to speaking up. But we speak up, as Audre Lorde says, even though we are afraid, we speak up anyway. Right? We have to speak for those who do not have a platform. And we have to recognize that there's a difference between not having a voice and not having a platform, because my mother has a very loud voice. And so do all the women in my family. Do they have a platform? No, they do not. And so I also speak for them. We have to speak for those who are not able to speak, but we also have to recognize that when we speak, it does not mean that our words are always welcome. It does not mean that we will not be penalized for that. And so we have to also stand guard and support each other and be willing to recognize when the pushback comes that there has to be a support system in place for those who are willing to kind of brave whatever they may have to put themselves forward and say, yeah, I'll speak to that. So I want to commend Dr. Hazari for her transparency for that reason. And I think everything that she says makes sense to me, and I can find parallels in the humanities field for some of the issues that I have been dealing with. I remember being told by someone who was on the university's tenure and promotion committee that when my book Caribbean Erotic came out, someone on the committee said, "Is that something we're supposed to take seriously?" And I never asked who it was, so I don't even know who it was, but I do remember that sticking with me. Is that something we're supposed to take seriously? This is a collection that has 20 pieces of fiction, 5 essays, 93 poems. Names like Audre Lorde are in it. Edwidge Danticat is in it. Opopama Adisa is in it. Cheryl Boyce Taylor is in it. There's so many, Heather Russell is in it. There's so many folks. I can't go through the entire list, but recognize names, right? Colin Channer, right, in this collection. And the question that was asked was, is this something we're supposed to take seriously? I'll never forget how that made me feel, how much work I put into that, with my co-editor, Opopama Adisa, and how it made me feel devalued, for all of that time I spent working on it, to hear that someone had the temerity to ask, is this something we're supposed to take seriously? And of course, I never tried to go up for full with it. I mean, I have the one book that my Eroticism, Spirituality, and Resistance in Black Women's Writings, which is what I used to get tenure. is the book that I went up for tenure with. And since then I have published Caribbean Erotic. I've published another book of poetry. So I have 2 books of poetry, Caribbean Erotic and the scholarly book. And I've never attempted to go up because I've always been told that that's not what we're looking for. That's not going to be valued. That is not going to get you full. You have to write another scholarly book. And I come from a tradition where we can write essays, where we can write border crossing work, and we do, and it is recognized. You know, we have younger scholars who do the same thing. We have Claudia Rankine who does, you know, that kind of border crossing, genre crossing work as well, and she's highly recognized. But that's why I'm saying this work that Dr. Settles and Dr. Buchanan has done is so important, not just for me personally, but for all of us who are in this position.
Thank you for those thoughts. I think the way that the particular plight of people in the humanities with regard to this epistemic exclusion, epistemic policing, epistemic injustice, I'm really glad that came up. There were a couple of comments in the Q&A about that earlier. So I think we've addressed that there are sectors within the universities where these problems are more and more evident, where people are more likely to have their work dismissed as research because it is humanistic, because it maybe is in social sciences, for example. So I'm glad that came up. I had a question here that I'd like to pose to Dr. Settles and Dr. Buchanan, but also anyone on the panel who might care to address it. There was a recent paper that came out from some scholars at Princeton on rationales for university diversity programs and the ways that the rationales may affect the way that people receive the impact of those programs. And the finding was that an instrumental rationale, which, for example, asserts that including quote unquote minority perspectives provides educational benefits, that rationale tends to lead, and I'm quoting here, to better outcomes for white students rather than for students of color. And I was, if your work, which as I understand is more faculty focused, do you see similar patterns? Can you comment on that at all? The alternative, I should say, to the instrumental rationale was a moral rationale, a social justice rationale, which spoke more to students of color, according to these researchers. I see you nodding your heads.
So not from our work. So NiCole, if you think of anything from our work, please chime in. Yeah, I mean, I think this is really important comment, because I think the instrumental, right, or sometimes it's called the business case, right? It makes good sense to have diversity. It helps us make more money in our corporations or be more productive, is very common. And, you know, critical race theory, part of that says is that there's this interest convergence, right? So advancement for people of color will come when white people can see that it benefits them as well. And so I think this instrumental case is a perfect example of that in practice, right? So that's how you get buy-in for diversity from people who might not otherwise see themselves as benefiting from it. But I do think that it's all about who is the intended audience, right? So it doesn't make marginalized folks feel better to feel instrumental. And it's a really great question of what happens when resources dwindle. Then do you take away the diversity focus? Does that get put on the chopping block because you only use it for instrumental purposes, right? So if times are tough and resources are short, then maybe you don't need diversity anymore. It's just sort of an add-on. Yeah, I'll stop there.
Dr. Hazari, please.
Thank you, Dr. Settles. I'm just going to build off what you said, and I'll use the context of my field just because it's a little bit easier for me to speak to that. So one of the things that we notice in science education is that there's a lot of new constructivist approaches that, I mean, for the last 2-3 decades, constructivism has been like one of the dominant, and social constructivism has been one of the dominant paradigms in science education. And so you see all these people pushing for active learning, for inquiry, for these kinds of approaches in the classrooms. And there's like millions of dollars of grants that have been funded to do this kind of work in the classroom. And many of them have been framed around equity and inclusivity within urban districts and things like that. And after a decade, you're not really seeing very positive outcomes for marginalized populations within those districts. And I mean, I think this goes back to the underlying problem. You can't solve a problem with a Band-Aid, right? You have to acknowledge the deeper root of the problem, which is the standards, right? Like what we teach, the content that's valued, the processes that are valued are very narrowly constructed without, and this is the issue of epistemic injustice, without the voices of people of color, of people, non-Western traditions, you know, women, et cetera, right? And so how can you assume that if we, I mean, it's 1 degree of freedom where you're taking the same old content, we're teaching it in a new way, and we're hoping this will inspire a new generation of students of diverse students to want to do it. But the original definition of what the content was is so narrow and was defined by primarily one cultural group. How can you assume that it's going to solve the underlying problem of epistemic injustice? So I think these are very big problems, but I think the first step is acknowledging them, right? So if you're doing constructivist practices, to acknowledge that what you're trying to have the students learn through engaging with the standards in constructivist ways is still very narrow, white, Western, colonial knowledge defined by primarily one group. And that acknowledgement is the first step to starting to move the needle maybe to more inclusive perspectives getting incorporated. And that's my perspective as well. Right? It's not about the check boxes. It's about the changing of the systems and the structures and the very epistemology of what constitutes knowledge.
I have to agree with both of my colleagues. I also want to say that when you devalue the lives of people, but you pretend that somehow you place value on their work, the disjuncture between those two things is going to be very obvious to the students. And it doesn't, why would students want to value the work of people who have no value? So we cannot create those kinds of separations between what is actually happening in the larger society and what happens in the academy. Those things are intrinsically tied together. You know, so we have to recognize the importance of that. We have to recognize how we're shooting ourselves in the foot, even when we have the best of intentions. That's why we cannot afford to be apolitical in our scholarship. That's why there is no such thing.
Thank you for those comments, all of you. And it makes me think about the way that sometimes faculty may think they should shut the outside out, and the classroom is a bubble where we only deal with the text or the problem or whatever it is. But for some students, that is going to be a nearly impossible thing to do that will deny their lived experience. So what you're saying, Dr. Rosoli, speaks to that to me. And again, it also comes back to this question of humanities, social sciences, and STEM fields, where it may be obvious for someone like me teaching American history that we need to acknowledge what's going on outside, but perhaps for a chemistry class or a biology lab, it may not be so obvious, and yet it may be equally important for the reasons that Dr. Hazari has pointed out. I wanted to craft a question from one of the remarks in the chat, which talks about leadership levels at the university. And so I think a lot of the remarks in the original the presentation that Dr. Settles and Dr. Buchanan gave were about the needs for people within disciplines to consider what they value, why they value it, et cetera. And then we heard about both the ways that interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary scholars, and those are distinctly different issues, have particular problems with epistemic injustice. But then the comment made me think about the ways that you might have had success in speaking to divisional heads, to deans, and to provosts about this, that might be slightly differently framed than speaking to people operating within disciplines and departments. And do you have any thoughts that might be helpful for us as we think about how to influence the leadership at our own institution?
I mean, I think that, you know, an important piece of this to raise to leaders is the way in which these processes operate invisibly, like evaluation processes, that the myth of meritocracy, right, operates without sort of anybody having negative intent. So we don't need individual people to be prejudiced or biased for epistemic exclusion to happen. And so I think really acknowledging that the problem is baked into our system, and so the system has to be the level at which we make adjustments is really critical. And this can be through you know, thinking differently about when you are doing your evaluations, what kind of information are you asking faculty to provide you with? Does it allow them to share everything about their scholarly impact or their professional selves, right? They're doing poetry and there's no place to put, you know, your creative works, then that can't be counted as part of your scholarship. Yeah, so I think, you know, the really detaching it from the individual malintent of doing harm to faculty of color is really critical for leaders, because I think changing individual bias is not enough. The system can still persist whether or not people have the negative intent.
Dr. Buchanan, did you want to weigh in on that as well, or I can pose another question?
I was thinking one, yeah, absolutely everything I said, as always, great. But I do struggle a bit with how do we get universities to understand and really value these differences. I think in some ways we need the pressure from both ends. We need students and faculty creating the pressure. We need to also be able to make these cases for how they are paying prices, how they pay a price for this. But I have also become increasingly concerned as I've been seeing changes in kind of the diversity of the people. Like, so now we have more people at the table. We have more people as faculty, you know, numbers for faculty of color have incrementally increased some. But what I am also seeing is that no one has really been looking at how do we need to change because of the people that are now here. So we bring diverse people in, but then we keep the process going as always, and then continually seem surprised that there are challenges, there are complaints that, you know, we brought in these new people with new perspectives, but we didn't think about how do we need to change to embrace these new perspectives. And really the better question, what are they bringing to us? What are the gifts they are bringing that really are allowing us to grow and to be better? You know, the idea of like, almost like you're doing a favor by bringing people in. Like, no, you're not. Like, you're making yourself better if you allow us to bring what we can to the institution. So I think there's so many problems at so many different levels, but being able to make these cases, use these examples, identify the policies, and then keep making noise about which of these policies are becoming problematic. That beautiful piece of what are people doing that can't be accounted for, and how does that translate into labor that's not rewarded? So I'll stop there, but yes, this problem is quite complicated. I tend to go with give them the business case to make them feel like they have some skin in the game, make them feel like they have a reason to personally be invested in it. But that's, as we've already said, it's also not enough to weather the hard times.
Thank you. Thank you for both of those responses. So we
Um,
have, oh, sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Kirsten, I was just going
Yes.
to add to that because of something that came in the Q&A also. I mean, I think there's a danger also of reinforcing certain hierarchies by taking the business model, which is the funding, right? Often STEM gets privileged because of the funding that STEM brings in. And there's a privileging of STEM fields over the humanities and other fields and other scholarly work. And I think that's deeply problematic. So I think there has to be an approach that is not just top down. I mean, there has to be things that are put into policies and structures, but I also believe in social movements. I believe in, a critical on growing a critically reflective collective of faculty who are pushing these ideas forwards. And this is the idea of Enzel Dua's mestiza, right? Like this critical consciousness that we need to raise in faculty about the hierarchies that we are creating ourselves. And we have to reflect on those, right? Constantly, because, it's easy to say I'm being marginalized, but I might be marginalizing somebody else, right? Being in the STEM fields, I might be causing somebody else to be marginalized. So I need to reach across the borders and elevate their work, right? And celebrate their work and push their work forward into the faces of others. To create this critical consciousness of what's happening. And if all of us are sort of engaging in this process, we'll collectively sort of push some of these hierarchies away, right? And I would say, like the person, Dr. Moore, I think, who put the question in the chat, he was talking about the STEM humanities and why isn't there a classics department? Well, in talking to my English colleagues who are people of color who don't work in the classics, they feel that the classics are deeply epistemically unjust because what is counted as the classics in English departments is a very narrow field of work that is primarily white, right? And so I think there's ways in which that we ourselves are promoting hierarchies even within our disciplines. And so we need to be critically conscious of that and trying to take a step back and then reaching across the boundaries and celebrating the works of others who are being marginalized in our spaces, even if that's not our own work.
I could not agree more strongly with that point. I really could not. The ways in which I see hierarchies being reified by people who are supposed to be conscious and woke alarms as well as amuses to a certain extent me, because I'm like, how could you not see the contradictions here? How could you not be aware, that you're like reinstituting the same kinds of binaries, the same kinds of gradations of worth that you're critiquing? We institutionalize it, we value it, we valorize it, we reward it. And we do so in the humanities as well, not just in STEM. And we do it uncritically. We can't even see that we're doing it. And that is so problematic on so many levels. And because of that, there is no transparency, little to no transparency, because there need not be any transparency. The leadership has decided. So it's a very top-down model. It's not about being empowered, it's about power rather than empowerment. And when we're operating from that model, the master's tools will always win.
We'll never tear down the
dismantle
master's
house. Never.
Yeah. Yeah.
When we're operating from that model. And that's the model we operate from. In the humanities. I can only speak for my discipline, in the humanities. I'm not talking about STEM.
Oh, in STEM also.
And in STEM also, but you know what? You have to claim your own piece and stuff, And so as somebody in the humanities, I just wanted to, I could not possibly commend that any higher, Dr. Hazari. Thank you. We got a long road ahead of us.
So with that in mind, I want to craft what might end up being our last question around some remarks that came in through the Q&A earlier, which is about how to keep this kind of conversation going. And particularly given what you were saying in the presentation about the way that there are institutional, there are policy and procedure level forms that this epistemic injustice, epistemic exclusion takes, but that people who are affected by it often end up personalizing it. They feel crazy, they experience gaslighting. And so my question is, do you have suggestions for successful models through which people can mobilize interpersonal resources, create support systems, create networks in or beyond their own universities to help combat some of this, which gets in the way of the work and is just personally deeply, deeply harmful?
I'll quickly say, rather than depending on just kind of what we're saying here, the journal Women in Therapy has I think a 2-volume special issue where it's women, diverse women in academia who have talked about how they made it through. And between the volume, they have so many different suggestions for different types of institutions, different levels within the institutions of how they were able to navigate some of these systems. So I'll encourage people to look at that special issue. It's again, Women in Therapy. And Isis and I can talk quite a bit about the things we did. I think it's a different conversation when we're talking about what can somebody do as an individual case versus what we can do for the institution or for the department or for our field. When we start to look at structural issues, the answers are very different than if I'm talking to somebody about how they personally are going to make it through their career in academia. I think there is power in numbers, but often we are the only ones in our department. So using the connections to create multi-level mentoring and contacts and partnership with people that may not be in your department, but do have a vested interest in your success and in providing the kinds of support we need to go through institutions that are often deeply harmful to us. So there's lots of things I would suggest if we have that individual talk, but I'll also encourage people to take a look at that special issue because the number of different types of examples are really helpful. And I saw Isis was about to say something too.
I was just thinking about, people talk about the invisible college, right? The like networks that you create with other people to provide sort of social support. I think part of it is, as Dr. Versoli talked about, like lifting each other up, shining light on other people's success, the mentoring. Our goal with this research is actually to put a name to something so that people can identify their experience as a thing, a real thing, not in their head, not a one-off. This is like the problem that we see. And when we present about this, we hear people from different institutions, even HBCUs say, yes, I've experienced this. All sorts of different kinds of institutions, different fields that is resonating widely, I think helps individuals feel that it's not about them. And I think there's a tendency to think, what have I done wrong that is making this happen to me? And really just highlighting that that's not the case. And I think, these networks are really important, but of course, they are less likely to be the way that we make change if those people are not also in power. So institutions need to put folks of color, other marginalized groups in positions of power so that their perspectives can actually influence policies and procedures.
Yes, and the newly formed Black Faculty Association at Florida International University was actually formed so we could create that kind of support system. And so with AWED and BFA and all the other institutions that are invested in diversity and inclusion, including the university one as well, I think that DEI, I think that we can create that at FIU, but we have to be very mindful of the fact that if we cannot have transparency in these conversations, it won't go anywhere. It won't move, the needle any. We have to be able to have transparency and to feel safe in speaking about these issues. So let's be mindful about those issues so that whatever we do won't be like, throwing water into a bucket with a hole.
All right, thank you for that. I'm looking again at the clock. So at this point, I want to thank you for your comments, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleague, Caroline Simpson, for some closing remarks.
Hello, everyone. I am Caroline Simpson. I'm a professor of physics in the College of Arts, Sciences, and Education, as well as an AWID Associate Director and the Case Equity Advisor. And it's my pleasure to say a few words before we leave today. And I'm glad I have prepared remarks, because after this very, very powerful presentation and discussion, I'm not sure I would have words of my own. I would like to thank our amazing keynote speakers, Drs. NiCole Buchanan and Isis Settles, for their insightful talk, as well as our other panelists, Dr. Zara Hazari and Dr. Aza Wersoli, as well as our panel moderator, Dr. Kirsten Wood, for this very thoughtful and very provoking discussion. It's been very rewarding to listen to such accomplished individuals and hear from them about their research into such an important issue that affects many of us and holds back excellent scholarship. This affects everyone, not just those experiencing epistemic exclusion. I'd like to also thank the AWID team for all their assistance and hard work in putting on today's event. And of course, I'd like to thank Susanna Rose for her guidance of the AWID office and of FIU Advance. Creating change at an academic institution can be tough going, as we all know, especially one as large and as varied as FIU. But her dedication and passion for this work has already generated positive change on campus, and she continues to be an inspiration for a lot of us. And finally, I'd like to thank all of you for coming to WFLI today. As faculty members, we know how hard we've worked at attaining our degrees and then attaining a position, and then at our teaching, our service, and our research. It's hard to know that racial and ethnic biases can devalue that effort in the eyes of others. This epistemic exclusion is part of this larger issue of epistemic injustice, as Dr. Hazari pointed out. There are, however, ways for each of us to enhance diversity and inclusion in our departments and on our campus by working on changing the system. I think that's become quite clear from the discussion today. And for this, as Dr. Wersoli pointed out, we need to stand together as a collective and be aware that the academy is not separate from the larger community in which it sits. Top-down solutions aren't enough. There also needs to be work by everyone to create a critical consciousness and to work together to elevate others, as was pointed out today. I hope you got as much out of today as I did. WFLI is designed for you, and the AWID office wants to know what you thought about today's events. Please be on the lookout for an email that will contain a link to a Qualtrics evaluation survey. I really encourage you to fill it out. It only takes a couple of minutes, and we use that feedback and comments to drive our future programming. If you have any questions, you can reach us at awed@fiu.edu. Thank you. I hope everyone has a great day.
Stephen, do you want to stop the webinar now?